Hey everybody, how's it going? Look, I moved the camera around so I could sit down, and because I think the pacing back and forth might be a little bit weird and confusing, and I almost look slightly more professional. Looks like every other picture that academics have been posting online. Oh, Annabelle made it and made it on time for the first time. Hi, Annabelle, how's it going? There's 8 people here so far. Um, cool. Um, I begin as I begin every class now in this post apocalyptic age, hoping that you are well, hoping that you are keeping safe, hoping that you are staying away from the people you need to stay away from and snuggling up to the people that you snuggle up to. Uh, hi, Giandra. Hi, Kima. Kima hasn't said hi to me. She's only said hi to Annabelle. That's cold, Kima. It's so very cold. I thought we were buds. Um, I'm going to see if I can keep this to 25 minutes. We all know I'm not going to, but I am going to see nonetheless. Brian's here. Annabelle's here. I did not send Andrea your B coronavirus picture, Annabelle. I will do that. I promise you. Um, let's get to it, shall we? What? What? And he says a third time, what did you think of this reading? He pauses. He knows that people can't type furiously. He also knows that there's a little bit of lag. Oh, so many people are online now. So cool. Everyone's best friends with everyone else. I really like this reading, but I'm actually going to start by someone asked me a question ahead of time, and they said, I'm just going to read it out loud. Maybe a bit of paraphrasing. I found the vampire thing interesting, but I think people are not that much into vampires these days and not at all scared or have anxiety about that. And I am not that much familiar about what the old generation think about vampires. Can you please talk about your prospect of vampires? Apparently, I am the old generation in this, and I have decided not to take it ultimately too personally, like when you were a child or something. So, back during the Blitz, um, there's a series called Twilight. That's how I came to know about vampires. It was not that scary. Most of the times in movies, vampires are not related to virus. It shows a species or a tale that's not going to happen in real life. Yes. But basically, the point is, I'm not familiar with vampires as are most Indians. It's an international student. So yeah, I mean, I think we can begin with this idea of looking at the point, which I don't think Andrea raises, but I don't think it's an omission by any kind of. It's not like a sin of omission that she's sort of assuming, as in much in the book, it's centered in North American and perhaps Western European pop culture, folk culture. And so, although I think it's applicable elsewhere, there's just things that are going to be potentially assumed. So the vampire, as the reading, I mean, the reading does give some history, but the vampire, at least in terms of the 20th century, has often been just a figure, a character of some sort. Certainly through literature, and then definitely through movies and comics and cartoons. And I mean, the amount of vampires that are kicking around things like Looney Tunes or Scooby Doo or all that are very present. So we've had this feature. Now it's filtered through pop culture. I think you can't escape the vampire as being part of a process that is syncretized popular traditions as much as it has done pop and literary traditions as much as it's done folklore. Vampire is a good illustration of that. Why it's kind of pointless for the purist to be thinking about, well, what is the folk vampire or what is the original? It was basically a name of some kind of creature that had certain connotations to the undead that quickly became absorbed. And our beliefs about vampires are and when I say beliefs, I mean basically much more in the realm of our ability to speak coherently and fluently about the vampire is basically assimilating a cluster of motifs that come from a variety of sources that are often contradictory, that are often uh, uh, there in order to, that were introduced in order to spur the story along. I mean, like the idea of the twinkly vampires in Twilight. The idea being that there are the idea being that they don't die if exposed to sunlight, but they are revealed. There's actually sort of beautiful. They're not deadly. They're not weakened by it. Um, if exposed to sunlight, so they twinkle in the sky. So that's why they move to Washington or Oregon or whatever wherever the town is, where they experience the most cloud cover, so they're not exposed to it. Now that is playing with the idea of what constitutes the fear of sunlight. That is read them anymore. But there's a short story / little playlet by Woody Allen about Dracula going out into the night, only to discover that's actually the day of a solar eclipse, and so he like leaves the castle for 20 minutes, and then it's like, oh, you're here to watch the eclipse. And he's like, what? Hilarity ensues. But the vampire, I think, and this is where Andrea's work really does help. The vampire works within the European and, by extension, the European diaspora context in North America, by virtue of really the inherent embodiment of it. If you want to think, you sort of have to grasp a kind of what they sometimes call Manichaeanism, or like the binary aspect that has really filtered Western thought. Well, since Manichae, but definitely through the Greeks, and then through scripture, and in particular, who would it be? Augustine and City of God, and so on. Basically, the idea of sort of a strict binary, not the same kind of complementary binary of, say, a yin and yang symbol in Eastern and East Asian thought, but rather the sort of the split, the good and evil split, and particularly about the body and the spirit. And so much about Western culture, as maybe you've noticed this by virtue of now having lived in North America for a few years and sort of seeing the strange prudery that is still endemic in our culture, and then of course the strange debauchery that is almost about just sort of showing up prudery more than anything else, as opposed to being a celebration of the self. It's more an act of defiance, or sorry, celebration of the flesh. It's more an act of defiance. But really, the sort of mind-body split that seems to be really part of it. We've talked about festival, we've talked about carnival, and we've talked about sort of during festival occasions, and particularly pre-Lent. This is the period of Lent, the time in the Christian calendar where we are commemorating the time when Jesus went into the desert and to meditate for 40 days, and he was tempted by Satan and a whole bunch of things. And it was just prior to him going to Jerusalem, more or less, to sort of accept the idea that he was there not only to be the Redeemer, but also to, in a certain extent, to also sacrifice himself. And so Lent becomes that long period of fasting, and we don't fast in the same way that you might fast in Ramadan, but we typically do move some of our things. We give up things for the 40 days. I'm not doing that, but the Christianity does that. But before Lent is the pre-Lenten festival. There's the Mardi Gras, Carnival, and it's that, as I said, the Carnival, the farewell to flesh, farewell to meat. And it is that moment when we know that we are going to be going into a period of great spiritual concentration, and therefore it becomes this process of embodiment. So we are gluttonous, we eat, we dance, we celebrate the fact that we are embodied beings, and it is a time of not necessarily sex, but certainly sexuality and display and being proud of the corporeal vessel that we have. But those are very limited and sanctioned moments. And I think you take that into the context of the vampire. One of the things, certainly about the European vampire of the 19th and 20th centuries, is this tempter. This character who tempts you in the same way that in sort of like Akkadian folktale, the devil might tempt you. He is about and it's almost inevitably a he. He's about leading people astray. He's about capturing the attention of particularly young women when their minds should be spent elsewhere in terms of piety and obedience and docility. Rather, they are out in the world and they become this sort of tempting figure. And so they embody this level of sexuality. And even today, they continue to. I mean, as Andrea says, over the course of the chapter, there's this movement towards the contemporary vampire as still being tempting, but not necessarily inherently as predatory in the same kind of way. Certainly not predatory on young women's souls. They are tempting. They are something that are alluring, and how the heroine has more agency in contemporary vampires. So they still function outside of the mainstream and outside of institutional culture, and they are still. I mean, their beauty is part of their narrative. They are a wonder to behold, and therefore they are part of that. They're an interplay between that strict dichotomy of spirit and flesh. So I think you need to be more familiar with this like obsession of purity and danger that is, and purity and chastity. That real moral code, a draconian conservative moral code that people, particularly the young, were sort of meant to adhere to, and how this tempter comes. So that got me going for a little bit. Kima said something, I can't help think of Vlad the Impaler each time vampires come up, especially modern vampires. They represent the possibility of harm or kindness, just like non-vampires. Yeah, the Vlad the Impaler has entered into the vampire discourse, and I think Stoker himself, Bram Stoker, the author of Dracula, the novel in the 1890s, he suggested himself that, or in sort of paraliterature or secondary literature, there was stuff about how Vlad was an influence, a historical figure, just a nasty, a brutal warlord, basically, who wasn't afraid of desecrating a couple of corpses to make his point. So yeah, Vlad the Impaler, good old Vlad. All right, I'm just going to say I wasn't able to print things because the university is kind of closing down, and I wasn't able to print my thing. So now I got a dual screen. You might notice that I haven't been looking over here where the screen is. I've actually been pretty good at looking at the Mr. Camera thing because I have the thing in a small little box. So so vampires and zombies, you can speak about them more or less in the same breath, although obviously there's a cluster of motifs about one that is no longer perhaps applicable to the other, and vice versa. So what does the association of vampires and zombies have to do with contagion? I mean, the three questions that Andrew's basically sort of addressing are: why in a book about contagion are we suddenly talking about vampires and zombies? Why have these emerged in the past? I guess you could make an argument 15 years, but a half century as well, and sort of echoes of it, to be such a dominant object of discussion, at least in modern age. And third, what are the implications, particularly for zombies being desirable, and how does that affect things? So again, picking up on the point that I've already made, they are about categorical distinctions, and particularly the distinction between the living and the dead. I mean, they are resurrected. They're resurrected corpses for the most part. Certainly, the vampire of old has that idea of a resurrected corpse associated with it. Many of the narratives, although not all of them, tend to sort of suggest that if there is some kind of turning into a vampire, there is a period of something approaching death before reemerging as. But it's not like coming up from the grades in the same way that sort of, zombie metaphors or zombie infections sometimes have with them. But at the very least, they are something that should have died and did not. So they're kind of they function similarly to how ghosts function, and that they're both uh, overlapping categories where overlap should not be. They're hybrids of the dead and the living. But again, ghosts are intangible. They do not have substance to them. They are ephemeral, and the zombie and the vampire are corporeal. They have flesh. They exist as bodies. So so again, that's why I think there is something somewhat distant. Now, these categories are also fluid. I mean, we can talk about the every now and then ghost narratives. Obviously, there's some kind of substance there because they're able to move things, even if it's just like drapes or chairs and stuff like that. But they are less corporeal, certainly, than others. So we want to think about their corporeality of it. And so many times, because they are like neither living nor dead, or they are between life and death, they're betwixt and between. We're going to have to throw in the word liminal yet again. They exist in this time that is neither one nor the other. They are sort of eternally dying. You could make an argument. I mean, one other way of looking at them is they have met all the conditions of death, save for the fact that they have not left. They have not departed, so they're liminal in that kind of way. They are transitional transitional categories, I guess the word I'm looking for. That they move between these two things that should be binary. I think there's a lot that I don't think it is incumbent on folklorists to bear the responsibility of the inherited tradition. But I think there is something interesting that folklorists can be asking, and have asked in certain conditions. But maybe we really need to sort of double down and do it in a sort of more systematic way about thinking of these. So many of our models are basically based on binary. And if we're moving away as a culture, we're moving away from sort of the absolutism of binary. Maybe we need to start at least addressing how these things that we talk about are not, they're not the folklorist doing this, but they are perhaps examples of the folk reinforcing binary categories. So we have to kind of like unpack that a little. The other thing I was thinking about, and it's sort of the point that I raised last class about Slenderman, is that these transitional moments, there's this liminality. Again, we have institutional cultures. We have things like institutional religion that are about the proper conduits and the proper behaviors and the safeguarding of the transition between the immanent and the transcendent world. That's what much institutional religion deals with in terms of rights, and certainly about rights of death and rights of birth for that matter, and prescriptions about who can and can't have children and who can and can't be fecund to begin with. And so I think in addition to, similarly to ghosts, there is something about the fact that these are short-circuiting, that those prescribed channels, because they've short-circuited, that's why you can also bring in the language of they have cursed, they are sinned, there's something there because they are falling outside of the institution. But I think there's just a thought there that can be unpacked in a kind of an interesting way. uh, about how they are sort of, yeah, because how they are sort of defiantly non-institutional, and when you are invested in the institution as as an inherent good, that's when it's a system of malice. I'm skipping ahead now because I'm also that's sort of the thoughts that have been coming through. I'm sort of, yeah. Uh, if we have this connection between the spiritual, between the immanent and the transcendent, between the living and the dead, between that's focused through institutions, then these things that are similarly pathways between the two, but are or fall outside of the imprimatur of the institution, they are objects of fear. But when it's the institutions themselves that are under some kind of scrutiny, when we see them as limiting or constrictive or failing or fallible or all those things that we can critique the institution, all of a sudden these sort of side paths, as it were, become shifted. They become something that is much more. They become something that is much more. What's the word I'm looking for? They become something that is much more one sympathetic towards, one appeal, one finds more appealing. So again, like the latter day vampire stories, and increasingly the latter day zombie stories. If you think of things like Warm Bodies and this emerging genre of sort of the zombie as a romantic figure, they are attractive because they are not constricting in the same way that they are that the institutional vampire is. So going just doubling back in a little bit of history, um, the vampire more or less emerges as a Eastern European frightening figure, something that is more or less some kind of resurrected corpse that is after you. That at the very least is a sign of danger. Um, and again, I sort of only have so much basic, fundamental, innate background in things like all the supernatural creatures of the world because I'm not a monster specialist. There are people who do that, and I can gladly direct you towards that. But basically, sort of an Eastern European frightening figure with motifs associated with it in terms of resurrection, or the dead resurrected, and so on. Excuse me. But yeah, so kind of like the fairies, presumably used as some kind of threat about the wilderness, and also if there's associated with curse, with they're caused by curses or they are forced to roam the land through the implicit idea of maintaining some kind of morality. Then you have that character introduced in through 19th century Gothic fiction, and I can't remember the name of the book that was written, or at least the idea was, that sort of famous weekend that Lord Byron and Percy Shelley and Mary Shelley and some other dude spent together, just flaked out of their minds on laudanum or whatever they did, and Mary basically hid from her terrible, terrible husband's terrible, terrible friends, and came up with the idea for Frankenstein, and more or less fundamentally invented science fiction. That same weekend, the dude whose name I can't remember penned an early version of of a vampire novel. Someone will fill it in, or I'll probably put it on the bottom of the screen when I can look it up afterwards and for the edited version. And yeah, so we've had this idea, this sort of figure that is more seductive, more intrusive, more calculating in their way. And the Eastern European part, again, I was, as much as I was saying about the having to understand through the Eastern, the Western, or the European tradition and the North American tradition, the doesn't mean that is universally held in Eastern Europe. the non-Romance language countries were often seen. I guess Romania is technically a Romance language, isn't it? So the Transylvania doesn't quite work, but certainly the Eastern European, the Slav as an ethnic group, um, is had been othered for a number of reasons. Certainly, in the middle of the 19th century, you had things like the Crimean War, and I know I'm sublating all of the Slavic countries in the same breath, but that's what racists do. So I'm sort of trying to speak into that, the general fear of the Eastern European, the rise of Eastern Europe. Um, and more importantly, you have the shrinking of Europe and the bridging of boundaries through things like the railways. So railways were a way of introducing people into these new cultures. So it doesn't work in the timeline for that original vampire novel, not original, but that vampire novel I was just talking about. By the time Bram Stoker was writing Dracula, there was an awful lot in there about the railways. It starts off with a railway trip. Jonathan Harker is on the train. The whole first couple of pages are about being on trains and crossing borders. That's not an accident. So the idea that Europe was fundamentally shrinking and that distant other is now closer to us. I mean, we are going towards them as opposed to them going towards us, but the world is shrinking, and so all of a sudden that the bizarre practices, hey, we all love Vlad the Impaler of that particular place. It's no longer simply an object of fascination; it's an object of proximity, and it becomes something threatening. So again, we should just read this absolutely every class, going back to Buchan and the Pet Chow. When the world starts to shrink, all of a sudden these things become much more tangible. Now it's in literature, not necessarily in a in sort of active belief systems, but they are motifs that are underscored and heightened by this. So the 19th century, you start having the suave vampire, who is still morally dubious. He is embodied. He's about the celebration of the flesh, but he's also aristocratic. There is an appeal. There's an undeniable appeal to his sultriness, I guess, to his to the potential that is in place. Yet he's on an object of danger. And then, most vampire stories are basically about how he's in the pursuit of virgin blood in order to survive, and therefore young women are threatened, I should say. And the threat against the young woman, the young white woman, is like the dominant motif in contemporary legends. You can read Diane Ty's articles, which I've never have been assigned, but I can direct you towards that, about women walking home at night. And Bill Ellis has this wonderful article. It's too long to read in one undergraduate class, but I should direct you towards it. And it's about how ice cream parlors in the early 20th century were sites of danger and sin, because ice cream was foreign and it was Italian, and the Italians, emerging as they were into North America as a rapidly expanding immigrant group, were the number one other at the time. And so you had ice cream parlors that are cropping up, and people are basically saying, oh, of course it's delicious. That's how they get you. And so the ice cream parlor, until the World's Fair of 1908 or something like that, I can't remember, until one of the World's Fairs, when the ice cream became sort of Americanized. Hi, Evie. Ice cream became Americanized and normalized. It was fraught with danger, and so it was like, young women, stay away from the ice cream parlors. You never know what's going to happen. And again, now the vampire has sort of switched to this sympathetic, alluring creature. The zombie is basically a sort of an appropriation of Haitian vernacular religious traditions, but filtered so heavily through colonial and pop culture lenses that the association is it's like a palimpsest. We know that it is there. We can always point back to it, but its correlation between what it actually, how it's understood in the popular culture and how it's understood within Haitian religion is it's night and day. Here's another analog: the relationship between the jinn, the Middle Eastern, for lack of better word, fairy, but little creatures, deserts, objects of potential objects of chaos, sort of trickster figures, and so on. Little people. They're a lot like fairies, a lot like the little people in Mi'kmaq, a lot like leprechauns, a lot of da, 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 da. That got filtered through pop culture, and particularly through things like the Arabian Nights, and which were, a 19th century colonial reappropriation through the eyes of Orientalism of the sort of fascinating Middle Eastern Arab culture. And then, the genie emerges. So we can speak of the genie legitimately as having some genealogical, forgive the pun, some genetic heritage to the jinn, at the same time recognizing that the two are virtually completely distinct from each other. So it's a both and situation. But then the zombie really took off after Giorgio Romero and Night of the Living Dead. That sort of is, purists might argue otherwise, but it's more or less the line in the sand of how the contemporary zombie is understood. Most importantly, I think the idea of sort of hordes of zombies. Some kind of infection takes place. If I recall correctly, Night of the Living Dead, it is a satellite had crashed to Earth and it was covered with some kind of contamination. So there's an extraterrestrial science fiction association with it. And then basically it is a contagion. So it isn't the poisoning, which is obviously contamination of the Haitian zombie tradition, the resurrection of a corpse that way. It is the communicable contagion or communicable conversion of the living into the walking dead. And that has kind of informed our zombie consciousness for the past half century. So Romero's work, 28 Days Later, they introduced the super speedy zombie. They used to just be, brains, brains, brains. Now they're brains, 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 brains. And it's like, oh, no, please, you're supposed to be slow and dopey. What am I at now? I'm at 32 minutes. I was going to be 25, and I'm on slide 5. So obviously vampires are certainly related to contamination in easy ways. I mean, for one thing, there are narratives sort of about like patient zero vampires, as it were, in terms of the dead, the curse, whatever causes that initial thing, and then how it's spread. And I think, the spread having to do with typically through the bite, obviously, where we're talking about matter out of place. We're talking about sort of the pseudo cannibalism. There are perhaps other other rationalizations on how it might function in terms of, venom, or in terms of the extraction of life essence, or whatever. The sin of cannibalism, contagious magic, a whole bunch of stuff can be imposed upon it. And again, we're talking about a cluster of motifs, so we don't have to have uniformity. In fact, I think uniformity of what is and isn't a vampire, or isn't a zombie, or isn't anything, and quite frankly, is again boring white boy Reddit bullshit. So you have, you sort of have this cluster, but certainly the intrusion of the other into the self. So through the bites, through sexual intercourse, through some kind of direct contact, you obviously have that notion of spread and aggressive spread. And again, historically, you want to be associating this with risk behaviors, because the idea that it is when you are alone, is when you are in dangerous places, it's when you are not within the shelter of, let's just presume, a safe patriarchal household, but you are off on your own doing things that you oughtn't do and entertaining thoughts you oughtn't entertain, that is when the vampire strikes. So again, until recently, there has been this sort of moral hazard approach to it. Zombies, of course, against Romero, even more explicit. You have this idea of it isn't simply it goes beyond the moral hazard because seduction isn't required. You can make correlations between vampirism and, say, the spread of STDs, and hence the moral hazard arguments that's thrown in, which we'll be talking about next class when we talk about HPV vaccines. But with zombies, they're indiscriminate. That they are coming after you. They don't really care whether you are virginal. They don't really care whether you are alone. It is a different form of opportunism, and so everyone is vulnerable. So they are much more associated with contagion, with spread, with what we are going through at this particular moment in time, as opposed to again, sort of like an STD model, as it were, a different kind of communicable, where direct and intimate contact is typically required. So much so that, as she points out, if you look at slide 6, you see a print off of it. The CDC had a whole education campaign that was built on how to survive a zombie apocalypse, and they have lesson plans for schools and so on. Some really interesting things. If you snoop around, there's a graphic novel on how to survive. I'll put the link to the main information page, and you can go through it. But again, it talks about preparedness, and so it's using the zombie as because it started in 2011, which is basically the time that Walking Dead started as a television show. The comic book had been around for a couple of years. But more or less, okay, well, this is a thing all about preparedness, isn't it? The risk factors for quelling, for stopping an apocalypse have to do with being prepared for it. And I think that's also one of the things that's interesting about zombies as one, and what distinguishes them from vampires is the risk factors associated and how to ultimately survive. So survival tactics, I have this on the slide, and I typed it so well yesterday that I'm just going to read it out. So survival tactics are not simply being chased and staying at home, but they have to do with being vigilant, with wariness, the ability to provide for yourself and your family, independent of societal infrastructure. Because so much, certainly like The Walking Dead, but other zombie narratives, the world has collapsed, and so the institutional culture can no longer protect you. So again, that sort of interesting idea. So on one hand, it appeals to rugged individualists. So there's this libertarian fascination with, this is what you need to survive the apocalypse. This is what you need to survive a zombie attack. So it's almost like The Road in terms of how desolate it is. The flip side of that is the idea that it's also going to be about building alliances and being prepared, and that society is only going to survive if we actually drop this radical individualism and come up with sort of constructive ways. And those two, I guess things like Walking Dead, you have those two narratives that are actually competing with each other. What is the best tactic for survival? Every person for themselves, or a rebuilding society, rebuilding a cooperative and egalitarian society. And so the zombie works that way as well. It has nothing to do with sort of being chased in the same way that the older forms of the vampire narratives are. A couple of people have been talking, so I just want to sort of go back to quotes. Kima said, I forget the title, but a recent zombie film that introduced to me a new concept was recovered zombies who remembered everything they did while they were zombies, and society holding them accountable. Yeah, well, once you've got, you never want to dismiss the idea that once something is popular, new forms might come out, but now you have to sort of, reimagine them, figure them out in a different way. Yeah, well, there was something about, they do have a kind of recovered memory zombie motif as well, don't they? And even such things as, even in like Shaun of the Dead, you have this, when Nick Frost's character gets turned, there's an idea that he retains some kind of memory of what it was before, of what he was like before. And as much as he and Simon Pegg are playing video games just like they used to, he's chained in the shed because he's still a danger, but they're still friends. And Megan shows up. Hey, Megan, how you doing? My dad and I always discussed how with most monsters you got caught when you didn't make the right smart choice, but zombies were different. You had to actively make a stupid choice to get caught by a zombie because it wasn't actually hunting, trying to trap you. Okay. Don't zombies sometimes try? I mean, are they just there? Or I don't know. Again, it's a cluster of motifs. So we will see. But yeah, so the association of contagion and endemic and pandemic with zombie is fairly clear, to the point where Simon Pegg, who I was just talking about from Shaun of the Dead, and Nick Frost recently just did that new PSA, basically talking about revisiting their how they are going to survive the zombie apocalypse, but in terms of like staying at home and social distancing and washing your hands and absolutely everything. So I'll put a link to that PSA up on the site as well. It's a cute enough little coronavirus thing, all done, of course, at their house. Simon apparently has someone who can operate a camera, and Nick only has like a cell phone or a laptop set up. Anyway, it's delightful. So we've been talking about the literal contagion, but of course there's the metaphorical contagion. And I think I've already basically covered this part because I started talking about it earlier. When the book came out, when Dracula came out, the book, when it came out, it was very much about Eastern Europe. It was very much about this new danger at our borders, and that the borders are coming closer. So the first chapter of Dracula. Left Munich at 8:35 p.m. on the 1st of May, arriving at Vienna early next morning. Should have arrived at 6:46, but train was an hour late. Budapest seems a wonderful place from the glimpse which I got of it from the train, and little I could walk through the streets. I feared to go very far from the station, as we had arrived late and would start as near the correct time as possible. The impression I had was that we were leaving the west and entering the east, the most western of splendid bridges over the Danube, which is here of noble width and depth, took us among the traditions of Turkish rule. So, right out the gate, chapter 1, paragraph 1, Dracula is about going east. And there was actually a BBC radio documentary a few years ago, all about revisiting Dracula through trains. So it was a travel documentary, but that it fundamentally that the shrinking, the modern world, and the how technology, particularly transportation, was shrinking the world is a dominant theme. And so again, a kind of contemporary legend annexed to it. So you have that as sort of a reasonably self-evident form of what Dracula, what the vampire represents. This kind of not simply the you establish this sort of living dead, but basically you establish someone who is disinterested, who does not follow the proper separations. And so, the supernatural contagion and moral contagion are one and the same. And then you could just take the figure and extrapolate that onto an entire population. For zombies, the metaphor has often been, certainly the Romero zombie, has often been about ideology. And that because zombies are typically arriving in hordes, and it's about groupthink, and it's about the loss of the individual and how they then move through space collectively and without much thought for themselves. So, like Dawn of the Dead is, the idea that the survivors are all trapped in a mall is not an accident. The Night of the Living Dead, the ideology is sort of certainly in place in terms of the weird conformity that was emerging and present throughout the 60s, despite the fact that the counterculture was emerging as well. It's kind of neat that it goes without saying, or goes without mention, that the protagonist, the hero in Night of the Living Dead, is an African-American man, and he survives all the way through until the police come the next day, and he's killed by them. He spoilers, he doesn't make it. Um, but he was fine. He was perfectly functioning. It was only when institutional culture returned that he became seen as an object of threat and needed to be eliminated. So yeah. Anyway, I'm not the first person to suggest this. Michael Coven has been working on, as I said, a couple of years. He spent his last sabbatical watching every zombie movie ever made, and he's done some really interesting things about the zombie as a post-colonial narrative, because it is so much about othering. But even Shaun of the Dead, I mean, the comparison between people who are sort of trudging their way through the service economy of early 20th century, early 21st century capitalism, just going about their business day to day, unthinking, not paying attention to the rest of the world. They make Edgar Wright, the writer, makes explicit comparisons one to the other. So there you go. Let's see. If vampires are no longer distinctly associated with Eastern Europe, does that speak to an increase in danger from the familiar? Anyone, any race can become a dangerous hybrid from inside the house, as it was. I think so, but I mean, certainly the idea that they now walk among us. Edward Cullen. I mean, they might be distinct. Well, that's the Twilight vampire. He might be distinct from. Somehow distinct from the rest of the community, but not by much, not by sort of a noticeable difference. And the fact that they can sort of walk amongst us so easily. And then you have True Blood, where they are allowed to exist, and that because they now have this ability to exist in sort of free society and vampire rights and so on, in that conflict, they're still othered, but they are not necessarily entirely associated with othering. They're othered by virtue of being vampires, not othered by virtue of being Eastern European. Annabelle. Ooh, I like that, Kima. I hadn't thought of it like that. So yeah, Coven has written about the post-colonial zombie, and it's an interesting reemergence. I don't aesthetically, you know me, I'm not much for horror, fantasy, or supernatural stuff to begin with as an entertainment, but it is kind of fascinating its resurgence. And it's for people other than me to write about. So yeah, the modern vampire narrative, the second to last slide, because again, I'm now 25 minutes over my time. So basically, Andrea's drawing on the work of Linda Lee, and her work on the romance novel, the fairy tale romance novel, which are almost exclusively. That's an overgeneralization, but the reworkings of Beauty and the Beast in the contemporary fairy tale romance novel are quite extraordinary. They're the revisioning of this narrative, where you have a tortured and potentially violent and brutal character, and then the young innocent. And often, certainly according to in later Grimm canon, lacking in agency, young woman becomes refigured through the lens of romance fiction, and to where she has a great amount of agency, and it's actually an act of empowerment to move towards the beast. The beast is then held in some kind of contrast with. The very things that make them beastly are actually strengths and not strikes against them. And so with the vampire narratives, you have the same kind of thing, as I said, with perhaps starting with Interview with the Vampire, but certainly in the past 20 or 30 years, as the institutional cultures begin to be frail. And Andrea talks about how in True Blood, Leonard Primiano's done this wonderful thing about the opening credits of True Blood, and how basically it gears the viewer to understanding that the vampire mythos needs to be understood. This particular version of the vampire story needs to be interpreted as an implicit critique of institutional religion, and even sort of the vernacular institutional religion. I know that's sort of somewhat contradictory of sort of the Southern Gothic uh, environment. So and similarly, you can make an argument that Twilight is pushing against the conservatism of LDS, Latter Day Saints morality as well, even though it's simultaneously commensurate with it. It's sort of a strange piece. It's sort of both is and isn't a piece of Mormon fiction. But basically, once the institution seems to be no longer the thing that needs to be reaffirmed as a fundamental vital good, the vampire sort of emerges not as a threat to that system, but as a counter narrative to that system. These are the points I was raising earlier, so I'm not going to dwell on them too much. But there's a lot of let's see, how did I write this on slide 9? A shift from the heroine as the victim of a predator to a willing paramour with her own agency. The vampire remains other but desirable, and the vampire is seduced as much as he seduces. And then the heroine begins. The heroine is also typically peripheral. I mean, again, in all fairy tales, the protagonist is somehow moved away from their family, and often the protagonist is someone who is an unlikely heroine or hero or heroine to begin with, a sort of broken family motif. But at the very least, from the stories, they are somehow already falling outside of the institutional culture, and so they demonstrate that they have as much, if not more, affinity with this ultimate outsider, the monstrous hybrid. Once their monstrous hybridity is made known, because they do walk amongst us, than they do with their initial situation. But again, you also have to be sort of a little bit cynical, not cynical in a particularly gross way, but you want to think about the association about that people, who the audience is for this, and the idea that everyone imagines themselves somewhat iconoclastic. I think most people, at least, understand themselves as somewhat iconoclastic, and certainly in their escape fiction, that they tend to. It's the same reason why there's such an appeal to Joseph Campbell, in that, or Ayn Rand for that matter, and that it's always about like some unrecognized genius who is trapped by other people in the circumstances. His light has been hidden under a bushel. And then, if only when provided with a chance, they're able to burst through and demonstrate themselves as heroic. So we associate with that, because why wouldn't we? Because we're all fundamentally depressed. And I think you sort of have the same thing. So I don't want to be cynical, because I don't want to tar people with the same brush. But the idea of the heroine as being, misunderstood or just not part of the larger enterprise. I think, as I said, most of us tend to think that way, that there's a lack of belonging. But that's the adolescent narrative, and I'm not saying adolescent in a disparaging ageist sort of way. Almost all of these stories are fundamentally variations on narratives that are about the transition from childhood to adulthood, which means a passage through adolescence, which means liminality, which means the individual taken apart from the group before being reintegrated into the group. So we also want to be thinking about that over and above the ideas about disease and contagion. That was my little rant. I don't know why, but I thought I had an idea and I wished to pursue it. And so I did. Yay me. Last sentence and I'll go. Institutions themselves is portrayed as decadent or domineering. and then just as monstrous and destructive in the insistence on purity and conformity as the monstrous hybrid is. As the monstrous hybrid is. Read it; it'll make sense. For some reason, when I read it out loud, I put emphasis on the wrong syllable, and it went all caca cuckoo. Anyway, it has now been 55 minutes. God damn it. I hope y'all enjoyed. 11 of you are still here. Your numbers were peaking back and forth. I have been editing them. I hope you've been. I mean, if you've been watching this, you don't necessarily need to see it again. But I hope you know that you can revisit them in a slightly cleaner version. At the very least, I've got slides and stuff, and I throw in a couple of pictures and things, just for reference sake. Next class, it is the Why Buy the Cow, the HPV narrative, the HPV vaccine narratives, again about moral hazard. Extra credit people, still submit your extra credit questions and we'll get going from there. And otherwise, if we don't have any more comments, I'll wait like 30 more seconds to see if there's any more comments. I'll just stare blindly at the camera while I do so. I should have done this before. I should have done this beginning of the semester. I'm sitting down. You can't see this because the camera's not there, but I took my shoes off and I put them on this little ottoman thing that I have in my office. And boy, is it comfy. I feel all cozy, warm, safe. Nothing? Okay. Anyway, as always, be well. We'll do this again 2:30 on Friday. John James, how my day? How your day? My day is all right. It's weird here. The campus is much more closed than it was on Monday. I now have to sign in and I have to sign out again. For some reason, they're using red pens, which suggests either they were woefully unprepared or it's some kind of satanic ritual that I have unwittingly put my little John Hancock next to. So it's a little bit freaky. Anyway, the whole campus, I mean, there's staff that are around. Like the cleaning staff are still here, which is weird because there's no one to dirty anything. But it's good because at least they're still drawing a paycheck. And I'm worried about what happens when all our contract workers, faculty are fine, staff are fine for the most part because they can do their jobs at home. But I'm thinking about like the poor people at Tim Hortons and so on. They are not university employees. They've been subcontracted out. And when they close, they're not earning paychecks. That really pisses me off. Have I watched Tiger King on Netflix yet? No. I just don't think I'm going to. I don't think I have watched anything like that. I am not above it. I hope no one thinks that I imagine myself superior to any of these things. I just fundamentally don't care about it. Sometimes I'll like watch the first 5 minutes. Like, no, I haven't watched Love Is Blind. I haven't watched The Circle. I didn't watch. I didn't watch what Don't Mess with Cats or whatever it's called. I just don't. I really don't begrudge other people liking it. I just can't do it. I just simply can't. I love you all very much, but please don't ask me if I watch these things because I will eventually say no. What I am doing is I am slowly rewatching I Claudius because of the John Hodgman and Elliot Kalin have a limited run I Claudius rewatch podcast. And so that has been my entertainment. And I'm also rewatching Happy Endings, which was a great sitcom from the early 2010s. That's what I'm doing. Coming up to midway through the last season of that. And so I'm trying to introduce my son to Parks and Rec. I think that's going to be my next challenge. But I just watch stand-up comedy on repeat, says Brian. That's a good bet. One of these days, I'll actually put together my stand-up comedy class. Not to do it, but to study it. I'm not going to make people do it. I'm not an ethnomusicologist. But until such time, yes, just watch and observe And yeah, I'm going to go. I see the timer is at 59:49, 50. That's just far too goddamn long. Be well, be safe. Leslie Knope would have had a binder for this. Hi, Andrea. I love you. Go away.